You know, I really didn't set out to do a bio picture about Elvis. But if you really want to explore America in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, you know, he's at the cross culture. He's right in the middle of it, you know. He's the rebel Elvis in the 50s. He's the kind of movie star Elvis in the 60s. And he's the lost Elvis caught in a trap in Vegas in the 70s. So it's almost like a kind of wonderfully punk but tragic American opera. So it was a perfect canvas to explore so many things. Yeah, it's a really unusual process for casting. I've never had it before because he was an outsider. But he has this spiritual thing where he lost his mother at the same age as Elvis. And one night he actually has a nightmare about it, and he goes down and plays the piano and he sings to his mother Unchained Melody, and that videotape got in my hands. And then I got a call from Denzel Washington who said, look, I've been on stage with this young actor, you're not going to believe how great he is. And pretty much from when he came in, he was already starting to be Elvis, and I never saw him not be Elvis day or night for 2 years. It's funny because what I saw happening just in Japan, maybe it'll happen here in Korea, I think young people understand that Elvis was the first ever idol. They also understand that the image an idol gives out and what it's like behind the scenes and the sacrifices and the complexity. Personal relationships for an idol are very complicated. Elvis was not allowed to show that he was having a relationship or fell in love. And that's true of a lot of idols. And so the only way they can really express themselves is through music. So the music in Elvis is not just Elvis music. I've tried to open the door by using contemporary artists as well. Doja Cat, Eminem's done a song, you know, all sorts of artists. I'm even working right now with a very famous K-pop star and a brilliant producer, just doing a tribute to Elvis. All sorts of artists are even doing other musical tributes to Elvis that are not in the movie. I think what we see here in terms of music is that we forget just how much Elvis has been an influence on music and culture now since he burst on the scene in the 50s. And it's starting to happen everywhere. We see people dressing up to go to the movie. We see people singing along with the movie. I'm not exaggerating because the movie's now being #1 in America, that people have seen the movie 6 and 7 times. This is really happening. So one hopes that people get together in groups and in Korea and get into the spirit of it and sing along. We all toiled and struggled to not show for a lot of young people. When I spoke to Rosé from Blackpink, you know, she only really knew Elvis through, you know, at first through Lilo and Stitch, but she's a very intelligent young performer. And young people either know the guy in the white suit, older people know the rebel. But I think what we see in this, and I hear it from you, is that Austin's allowed us to see the person. And so often with idols, people see the stage performer, but they don't see the person inside. So I'm very honored that you have had that experience. Yeah, I think so. I think we know it's called show business. And Colonel Tom Parker represented the business. And he, played by Tom Hanks, and he was a genius. He invented all sorts of incredible things like the first satellite concert, the first greatest hits album. He was the one that invented merchandising. But then making money out of Elvis overtook the artist Elvis. When the business and the artist are in a good balance, where the artist has some control and investment in their art, and there's a true partnership, that's a good thing. But when management or making the money overtakes them, then the artist becomes, as Elvis says, caught in a trap and they can't get out. There lies suspicious minds. Well, I always think when it comes to art, you never play favorites, because it's like, is a song like Jailhouse Rock better than Suspicious Minds? I mean, they're completely different works. I like You know, it's like with film, you know. I love Batman, great. But also Elvis is different, you know. There are just good and bad films. But I think of course, there are great K artists happening right now. But some of the earlier ones too are tremendous influences. I mean, I think going back to, say, Rain, very early on, an actor, performer. Clearly, G-Dragon is a total icon and a fashion icon. And also, I think he was one of the first K artists to really bring that mix between hip-hop and rock and roll, which has now become really fresh again. You know, Blackpink, what Teddy Park does with Blackpink, and the team themselves, they're up there with the Ronettes or some of the great women's groups of the 60s, in my opinion. Do you know, obviously BTS, you know, what's so great about BTS is that they're the full package, and, you know, they have a great balance as a group. You know, they have real agency in what they do. You've got to admire what Mr. Bang does in making sure that the artists have ownership. To me, they are the Korean Beatles in a sense, in that the Beatles, they can mature and grow. So there are many more K artists I could talk about. CL, for example, broke a lot of ground, I think, for female rappers. She did brilliantly in that regard. I could go on, you know. But what's really great about it is that there's always been an ability in Korean culture to take the influences, obviously having American soldiers here in the 50s brought Elvis here. He was the original idol. But what's great is Korean culture takes that and makes it its own. And then it makes something new. And that's what happened with rock and roll. Rock and roll is African rhythms and Irish tune. And they come together and something new is born. So yeah, I would never say one is better than the other. There's just exceptional work and unique work and creativity that is owned, and work that isn't, you know. J Park, for example, is doing something different and interesting too. There's just a long, long list of really, you know, I think Stray Kids are bringing great new energy to the scene. Well, there are more than I mentioned, you know, when I start, that's the problem. When you start making a favorite list, you know they're not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's this here. There's just artists who truly are expressing themselves, and that's a lifelong journey. And I think we've got to be a little careful and understand that artists can fail and also make mistakes. You know, they're not gods. And with Elvis, we held him up to be a god, and it destroyed him. He fell very harsh. And I think that the fans and management and the government and all of us have to understand that it's an enormous pressure to be creating uplifting fantasy and beauty and art for us. And that can be very destructive if we're not kind enough to allow them to grow and make mistakes sometimes. You know, I so rarely make movies, and I have lots of ideas of what I'm going to do, and I work on them all the time. But then I take a moment, which I will at the end of this, probably in August and September, and I just disappear from the public thing, and I regain my own spirit. You know, I have the same problem as some performers. I have to refuel myself. And then I'll look around and I'll go, what can I make that would be really useful in the world? So there are all sorts of possibilities. But I certainly dream of making something that is a coalition between where I'm coming from and the K culture as well. You know, there's such a vitality here. Also, it's in relationship to Australia and America. We're like a nice triangle, you know. But I'm not saying what I'm doing because I really don't know. And if I say it, I have to do it. Okay. Yes, you know, actually, Joe, I have a great interest in Korean culture, both in music and movies. I have a lot of friends, and I'm thinking of some projects that might actually be Korean-based. So I was really coming to catch up with my Korean creative friends. But when I got here, the enthusiasm from the Warner Brothers team here for the movie, the excitement I could see for the movie, I couldn't help but say I should stay longer. And I've got to be honest with you, I've been working with really exciting K-pop icons. I'm making some music. I'm doing that right now. And doing further work like that. But I think when you get here in Korea, there's just a really great energy, so it's hard to get away from it. Yeah, it's a good question, Joe. I didn't really want to do a biopic about Elvis. I just thought if you want to understand America in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, he's a great canvas to explore big ideas on. I mean, what's so interesting about Elvis? He was the first ever idol. There was no pop idol that was globally famous before Elvis Presley. And because I'm working with Korean pop idols, that's something they really understand. And something else you really understand is when at the height of your fame, you suddenly have to go off to the army, as Elvis did. And one of the big dramatic questions in the movie is, when he goes off to the army, will he be successful again when he comes back? And that's a big dramatic idea. Now, the other big theme in the movie is the relationship between Colonel Tom Parker, played by Tom Hanks, and Elvis. And that's the relationship between management and the artist. And I think that's something a lot of people in the Korean entertainment industry understand, and also the fans. They really understand this relationship between the cell and the soul of an artist. And the last thing I think that you really get to get out of this movie, and it's true to the fans, you really understand young people. They really understand the price of fame. That what it looks like on the outside is not necessarily what it is on the inside. Well, I think if fireworks is a metaphor for an explosion of energy and light, it's bright, it's dazzling, but then it's gone. It falls from the sky. And I think that there's probably a truth in that, in stardom. That there's a great excitement in the movie, particularly if you see it in one of these great cinemas that you've got here in Korea. Amazing sound, spectacle, color, all of that. But it burns brightly, but there is a tragic side to it when it comes to the price of fame. I mean, in the end, fireworks illuminate the sky, but then they're gone. I hadn't heard of Austin Butler before, and very few people had. And he did this incredible tape. He lost his mother at the same age that Elvis lost his mother. And one night he had a nightmare about it, and he sent a tape of him singing to his mother, Unchained Melody. And then I got a call from Denzel Washington, who said, look, when you see this young actor, you're going to see an actor who works like no other. And for 2 years, Austin worked on being Elvis nonstop, day and night. I never saw him out of character. I never knew what his real voice sounded like. And even now he's having trouble getting his real voice back. So I think a lot of talk, of course, it's too early to talk about Oscars, but people keep talking about him being the #1 contender for Oscar. And I think that that's legitimate because it's an extraordinary performance, no doubt about that. Yeah, they don't have control over the estate. They didn't really see the script. They didn't make any influence on it. I spoke to them early on and I got some information, but the pandemic came between us. And I don't think I've ever screened my movie or a movie and ever been more nervous about how someone might react than when Priscilla saw the movie. Because critics and experts can say what they want, but Priscilla was married to Elvis. Lisa Marie's Elvis's daughter, Riley, the granddaughter. And when Priscilla saw the movie, I was so nervous. And when she saw it, she was very cynical. She said, how can this young guy do the performance? So that when she wrote me the note and said, no one's come even close. And if my husband was here, he would say, hot damn, you are me. That was maybe the best moment in the whole experience. Well, that's a good question, Joe, because unlike my other shows, I can create everything. But in this show, I had to create reality as well. I was handed slices of absolute reality that I had to reproduce. If you go on the internet, you'll see sections of the Elvis footage and Austin compared, and they're identical. But then I also had to imagine and create parts of Elvis's life we don't know about. So I think it's different in that regard. Plus, the concert sequences had to be very, very accurate. And Austin was so great that when he was doing the concert sequences, honestly, my crew had trouble working because they thought they were at the real concert. I mean, he did so much more music than we have in the film. And in fact, I'm going to announce here in Korea that every week we keep Elvis in the cinema, I'm going to release an unseen piece of footage from the movie. It's a good question because I've been interested in Korean culture. Actually, from a funny, many years ago, but then when I was doing Gatsby, which is 2016, 2PM, the band, did an album called, I think, F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I looked at it and I went, wow, there's so much care and passion taken in creating Korean music. So I got very interested in that, and I always liked the Korean movies. But I think what it is philosophically, I think Korea's always had to think outside of the borders. That's one thing. They've had to think globally because of the population. But also I think because of the fact that GIs were stationed here. Elvis has a direct connection to K-pop. The fact that GIs brought rock and roll into Korea early on and it mixed with local talent. You see Korean popular culture being able to bridge both Western influence but making it their own. And so they've been very successful at like America, taking many influences but making their own culture. And I think it's an exciting period for Korean culture. And I don't think it's a fad. I think it'll transform and transmute, but I don't think it's a fad. It's an exciting epoch for Korean culture. I mean, I never want to say exactly what I'm doing because once I do, I have to do it. But I wouldn't think it's certainly possible. Yeah, I like to say to my fans, Elvis's fans, but much more importantly to young fans of popular music, of popular culture. The film's not just about Elvis. The film's about you, because it's about becoming famous overnight. It's about commercial selling versus artistic selling. And also Austin Butler, remember, he plays the character, was the first idol ever. There was no one that was, 19, being a truck driver. And overnight, he's the most famous man in the world. And he's so wealthy. And the music in it, I've tried to do something with the music in it whereby, even though it's classic Elvis, Jailhouse Rock, I've also got lots of guest artists like Doja Cat and Eminem and all sorts of artists doing weaves. And in fact, I think you might be interested to know there's maybe a famous K-pop icon about to do something. I'm not going to tell you right now. But all sorts of artists are weaving and opening doors into the music. But mostly the thing I'd like to say to the young Korean fans is, I think you'll learn a lot about life and love and the creative journey and the perils of fame.